in 1966 and published a year later in 1967. It concerns the few remaining survivors of the human race who survived a nuclear apocalypse brought about by a supercomputer known as AM, which gained sentience and began blaming humanity for its own creation and hating its own existence. And he brought the remaining human beings underground inside his computer mainframe in order to torture them for all eternity. And the story is told through the eyes of one of these survivors, Ted. As a way of mentally manipulating and torturing his victims, Am has set himself up in this new altered reality as a sort of god. He has the ability to physically and mentally alter and manipulate the perceptions of his captives. He hates his own existence and humanity for creating him, which is kind of a perverse turn on its head of the traditional Christian view of God creating humanity. He lacks the ability to create. He can create simulations, which in some aspects are real, but he cannot create life and he cannot prevent death. He has the ability somehow to elongate life, and that's never extrapolated on throughout the story, but he's able to prolong his human captives' lives well beyond the average human lifespan. So he does have some control over human biology, but it's a very limited extent. And his primary delight is in constantly twisting the realities into his own pleasure, which again is a perversion of God creating the earth in his own image and humanity in his own image. Ellison's story presents a unique depiction of existence in which reality and simulation appear to coexist, and the story's narrator, Ted, is able to discern his reality from Am's many simulations. This phenomenon of reality and simulation existing side by side does not fit into any current definition of reality or simulation. So what this presentation hopes to do is introduce the concept of co-reality, the coexistence of reality and simulation that will expand on current scholarship and also demonstrate the independence of reality from simulated events. The idea that reality and simulation could somehow exist side by side dates all the way back to the ancient Greeks. In Plato's allegory of the cave, a group of prisoners have been locked inside and chained inside a cave their entire lives, and their reality has been manipulated by their captors into a simulation. They only experience shadows and light on the cave walls. And towards the end of the little story, one of the captives is brought to the mouth of the cave and allowed to experience the outside world for the first time. And so this prisoner who has lived in a simulation is finally allowed to experience reality very briefly before being locked back inside of a simulation. And so not only do we have an instance of reality on one side and simulation on the other, but we also have a prisoner who's able to experience them both, whereas the others have remained locked inside the cave. So this definitely provides a basis origin for the concept of co-reality. The only difference being is that this prisoner experienced each one separately. He now knows that there is a reality and a simulation, but he does not experience them side by side together. And in order for it to be a co-reality, he has to know that they're both there and he's experiencing both at the same time. And in this case, he does not. The concept of virtual reality distinguishes itself from the idea of co-reality because a virtual reality is a simulation that is easily discerned from reality, and the person experiencing virtual reality knows that they are experiencing virtuality. So their reality is temporarily displaced by the simulation, in this case, virtual reality. And they no longer exist in their normal state of reality. They exist instead in the simulation. And it's one that they can see through. It's one that they know that they are experiencing, but they no longer experience the reality. They're only experiencing the simulation. And in order for it to be a person to exist in a co-reality, they have to be experiencing both at the same time. And in a virtual reality, the user interface is only experiencing the simulation, not reality and simulation simultaneously. A simulated reality is one that's very similar to virtual reality, only in this case, a simulated reality is a simulation that is much harder for the person or people involved to discern from reality. They may know that they are in a simulation, but they are very skeptical, or they might start having a lot of doubt as to whether or not they are in a simulation, but there does exist within the simulated reality a certain kind of distinction that the user may be in a simulation. It's not completely opaque. This is a phenomenon that is experienced throughout I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream by multiple characters. The character Nimdoc is a shining example. There are several instances throughout the story, especially at the beginning, where he has an inkling that something he's experiencing was a simulation created by Am, but there's still enough reasonable doubt for him to suspect that it's actually real and actually happening. And Ted has to go out of his way multiple times to try to convince Nimdoc that he is experiencing a simulation instead of the reality. In Catherine Hales and Nicholas Gessler have expanded on the concepts of virtual reality and simulated reality by taking it a step further and coming up with an idea of a mixed reality, one in which reality and simulation exist simultaneously and support one another, but the result is ambiguous. It's impossible for a person to know whether or not they are in a reality or in a simulation due to the two concepts intermingling with one another. Ted's experience throughout I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream is not ambiguous. He is aware of the things that are happening that are caused by AIM, which are simulations, and he knows what is happening in the reality around him. He sees both at the same time, and if a person is caught up in a mixed reality, then they are unable to experience both. It's either, again, one or the other, and that is not the case that is being represented by Harlan Ellison in this story. Jean Baudrillard has expanded on the various concepts of reality and simulation even further by coming up with the idea of a hyperreality, a simulation that becomes so real that it displaces the original reality and becomes the new reality. In a hyperreality, only the simulation remains, whereas a co-reality, which is what I am arguing, requires the presence of both reality and simulations simultaneously. It doesn't matter how real or how unreal the simulation is, there has to be an underlying reality that is built upon by the simulation. And in Baudrillard's theories, the simulation becomes the new reality. So there is no reality, according to Baudrillard. It's only the hyper-reality. And since Ted, throughout I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream, can distinguish reality from simulation, his predicament cannot be a hyper-reality. As I previously stated, in order for there to be a co-reality, reality and simulation have to exist side by side. So in order to make the case that Ted, throughout I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream, is experiencing a co-reality as opposed to any of the previous forms of simulation I've talked about in this presentation, I have to distinguish the reality within the story from the simulation. And the reality is that before destroying the human race, Am brought Ted and his fellow prisoners underground into his mainframe. And throughout the story, Ted describes this as a cold, metallic environment, void of all life, computer panels, wires, circuits, and whatnot. And that is their reality. That never changes, no matter what simulation Am throws at them throughout the story. This cold, lifeless computer world is their reality. And on top of this, Am creates simulated corpses, monsters, various psychedelic and physical effects, nightmares, many different kinds of torment that Ted and his fellow captives have to endure. And even at the end, when Ted is the last man standing and Am is maliciously torturing him and altering even his perception of time, Ted is still able to recognize that his perception of time is being manipulated. He's still able to see that Am is creating simulations and turning him into a simulation in which he walks around as a mindless blob of jelly throughout the cold simulated computer world. So there is a reality that never changes, and there's an ever-changing slew of simulations, and Ted is able to see them both. And because of this, he exists in a co-reality. So in conclusion, Ted's predicament throughout I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream does not fit within the current framework and definitions of reality and simulation, and this necessitates the need for the new concept of co-reality. Simulated horrors demonstrate both the consequences of technology becoming too advanced and the blurring of the lines between reality and simulations, such as social media and video games that are becoming more and more common in the real world. The idea of a co-reality can enable people to stop and take a better look at their place in the world and better associate truth from falsehoods. Thank you very much for joining me with this presentation. Here is a work cited with various sources if you're interested in further reading. And other than that, thank you for bearing with me and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, great presentation, John. Thank you for that. That's what's so good about OMNI is you hear different stories, different books that you may not have read, but you get a good understanding of it in about 12 minutes. So it's very nice. So thank you for that. And I really like the layout of your presentation. Good amount of words to pictures. So good job.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Now's the time where I'll open up the Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you came up with along the way while listening to John's presentation, now's the time to ask. I guess we can do maybe like a raise hand or just kind of jump in, but I'll let John facilitate who he wants to select, if that's okay. All right, so any questions for John?
Vanessa?
Jump on in.
Yeah, go ahead and you can go ahead and ask, no big deal.
All right, my question's about the authenticity of the narrator Ted, because I've actually read this story before, and during the story, he, even though he claims to be unaltered by do you think he, at least in my opinion, shows signs of certain forms of paranoia or delusion? And do you think he is authentic as a narrator or not?
That's actually a really good question. And I don't think any human is strong enough to withstand everything that Am has thrown at them. I do feel like there might be some bias there, but I think that as far as the group is concerned, he's a lot more unbiased than the rest of them. He's a lot quicker to pick up on certain simulations than a lot of other ones are. I think with any character in any story, you kind of have, unless, I think that you always have to take authenticity with a grain of salt, but I always got the impression from my reading that Ted was more authentic, at least for the most part, than everybody else in the story.
Right.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
No worries. Vanessa, did you have a question? I saw your hand raise up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so then what is like the difference between mixed reality and hyper reality then? Because I was having like a difficult time, like if they're like
a question of to clarify mixed reality and hyper reality?
Yeah, they seem very similar, so I was like
very similar. That's a good point. A mixed reality is, I guess a good way to put it is take a person and put on VR goggles, and you have a technological simulation put on top of a human being. So you kind of have a what's the word I'm looking for? You're being supplemented by the simulation. So you've got reality being supplemented by the simulation, but there's still a blurring there of what is the reality and what's the simulation. In a hyper reality, the simulation takes over completely. So the simulation is the new reality. There is no, the old reality is left in the dust, and the simulation is the new reality. So it's still two distinct phenomenon, but the reality is gone, replaced completely by the simulation. And it is so real that it is a new reality, if that makes any sense. So the mixed reality is the simulation and the reality working together, but unable to differentiate sometimes between the two. And the hyper reality is pure simulation that has become so real that it's indistinguishable from reality. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Jade has a question here in chat. What would you say is one of the impacts of this project, and does it relate to transhumanism and that we may be tracking towards? I think one of the biggest impacts of this project to me, and in a way I do think it relates a bit to transhumanism, although I did not do this project with that idea in mind. So that's going to require some further looking into. But as far as one of the major impacts of this project, I mentioned a little bit about this at the end of my slide a little bit, but I think that it forces us to take a look at some of the different simulations that we have in our lives, and possibly want to also help us take a look at the relationship that we have with the technology that's forming some of these simulations, like social media. Our social media presences, in a way, is a simulation, and some people get lost in that simulation. Some people get so caught up in their video games, which is also a form of simulation, that they act completely differently and have their own presences in social media and video games that are completely different from their real life persona, but it's taking on a life of its own. We're becoming so intermingled with these different simulations that I think that this project can help people take a step back and not become so involved. Being able to separate what they see on social media from the truth, because not everything you see and read online or in the news is the truth, but a lot of people take it for granted. And I'm hoping that this will help people cut back on that a little bit. I hope that answers your question, Jade.
Hey, John, good job. Strona here. Excellent job in distinguishing the definitions and demarcating the differences between, reality and simulation. And really props to you in regards to coming up with a term on your own, this concept of co-reality. My question is in relation to picking up on what Scott alluded to. Do you think that the characters experience some kind of dissonance in this and in attempting to exist and differentiate between this simulation while simultaneously being aware of what you're considered to be the real? Did this cause some kind of dissonance or cognitive dissonance or issues or consequences with the characters in attempting to make or distinguish between the real and the simulation?
Again, I don't think anybody could go through what those few humans have gone through without experiencing some form of dissonance in a way. For some reason, Ted seems to be a whole lot stronger than most of them, because he seems to be, even at the end when he's had even more horrors inflicted on him than the others have, for a sole purpose of him being the only conduit for Anne's rage. I feel like in a way he's accepted what's to come, because I don't think he would have taken the risk of ending the lives of his former captives and sparing them the future pain, and knowing that he couldn't do it to himself. I feel like he's accepted it, and I feel like that's kind of caused a barrier, a kind of mental barrier that's kind of kept him from becoming too out of it, per se. I wish there would have been more at the end there as to how he was. I mean, physically, you see him transformed at the end as a punishment. I wish there would have been more at the end about how he was mentally tormented through all that. So yes, I do think there is some dissonance. I do think that there is some. I do think there were some serious effects going on, but the author didn't really elaborate too much beyond the physical in that, and I can only conjecture at that point, or at this point.
Is it okay if I follow up on that?
Please do.
Can you extrapolate any consequences potentially in outside of the artifact for us as individuals? I imagine, are we experiencing, where would you consider our current, reality? I think of the individual, I'm not talking about myself, but I might be, that has a role-playing character that he's leveled to the level 60 and created in this virtual space, and he seems very real, and the items that he has attained seem very real, and the journeys that he has embarked on seem very real, but in reality it's a computer-generated simulation, right? It's
right.
Not real, although there is a market to buy these fake swords or real swords, right? So can you talk about how it may impact us?
Well, first, let me ask you: is the individual or individuals in question, are they able to discern that their character and stuff is, a character in a video game, or are they seeing it as a,
I think
like,
that's the question. I think that we slip. I can slip back and forth potentially into thinking that the character is real, and then having to remind myself it isn't real.
Yeah, so it seems like there is some blurring there between hyper reality and co-reality potentially, or potentially it's possible even. See, that's something that I'll have to look even more into for future research, because this is something I want to continue with, but the possibility of jumping between the two, like forgetting sometimes that you're in a simulation, but then remembering, that's a very good point. And I think that idea right there hits on just how important this research is, because I think it is possible for us to forget. It's easy for us to I see all your questions, Joan, and I promise I'm hurrying up so I can get to them. Real quick though, Ted does not die. Ted is turned into a giant gelatinous goo that is unable to hurt himself, so that Am can ensure that he has one victim for the end of time to torture and punish. But Professor Strona, I think that the main consequence for us is that it is easy to forget. And I think that does pose a danger for us. In your or that individual's case, financially, because you forget that the transactions in the game are coming out of your real life bank account in the real world. Or if you go on social media, getting back to the social media angle, you get into a heated argument with somebody because you have the facade of the computer screen on, and you piss the wrong person off, and they hunt you down in the real world because that person does not distinguish between the computer and social media and reality, whereas you might, and that places you in a potential danger. So there are potential consequences here, and I think that this research needs to remind people to be better aware of your virtual and simulated surroundings, because it's very much just like it shows in the story with Ted and the others. Just because one person sees themselves in a simulation doesn't mean everybody else does. And I think socially that can create some issues. Am I going over?
Sorry, but yes, we are going over, but I was just going to say, let's have you answer Joanne's questions, and then we'll get into the next presentation. But great discussion, so that's good.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah.
All right, Joan, I apologize. So yeah, Ted does not die. Why do you think that Ted was stronger and obviously different than all the other people in captivity, and therefore the last one standing? He was the last one standing because he killed the others to spare them of he purposely murdered them so that they wouldn't have to go through what he was going through. Doesn't this show that he was stronger than Am in some ways? Yes, I think so, because he flat out defied him, whereas Am went out of his way to make sure that nobody could defy him. And that's kind of why he got even more bad stuff happening to him at the very end. And I personally cannot answer as to why Ted was stronger than the other people. Ted hints that he is different. Ted hints throughout the story that there is a difference between him and the others, but he doesn't extrapolate on it too much. Definitely going to have to take some more analysis to see if I can come up with an answer. But I read the story probably a good dozen times, and I was looking at questions like that, and I couldn't come up with an easy one. So there's definitely much more research to go into this. This is the very beginning of my research into this project. So thank you for bringing those to my attention.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I'm sorry I'm not able to answer that one clearly, but the
Oh,
research
no,
is
that's
continuing.
okay.
The research is continuing.
Well, good luck with that. Good.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all your great questions, everybody.
Yes, thank you, John. That was a wonderful presentation, and the Q&A went very well. So thank you for that and all your hard work.
Yeah, I'm
And
sorry I went over a little bit with that.
no worries. We had time. I apologize. I was actually going to scratch my head when I put my hand up, but that was a good cue anyway, so it was perfect.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience. We are going to move on to our next presenter. Let me pull up all our stuff. So we have Vanessa Humon, and she'll be discussing how algorithmic mitigation is used to prevent algorithmic bias and discrimination. So let's move on into her presentation. It sounds very interesting. Vanessa, I will be sharing my screen, and the floor is all yours and your pre-recorded presentation. And then again, we'll have our Q&A at the end. So be sure to be listening for any questions you may come up with.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Humon, and I would like to go over how is algorithmic mitigation used to prevent algorithmic bias and discrimination. Firstly, what is algorithmic bias? They are systematic errors in computer-developed programs that can have disproportionate results that can target certain groups of users. An example for credit cards would be the Apple Card, in which multiple users had complained that the credit card gave higher limits to men. For search engines, examples would be when Sophia Emotion did a search for the term Black girls back in 2011, and the first result was a highly sexually explicit link. She did another search for Why Are Black People So in Google, which also had terms to fill in the question that were highly stereotypical, which could reinforce present biases in the person searching. For advertisements, social media companies gathered data on what the user watches, clicks on, or the topics that they frequent, along with the personal information that they provide, like birthdays. Through that, they can predict and assume the type of person you could be and what you would like and what you should see. Now, what is algorithmic mitigation? It is like cleaning the flaws caused by these algorithmic biases. Algorithmic mitigation is necessary for the ever-expanding world of the internet and technology. More companies and jobs are using machine learning, which rely on these algorithms, like in healthcare. Some medical diagnoses consider racial characteristics that can easily carry bias or views of discrimination. How does algorithmic bias affect users? One of the common issues that can arise from algorithmic bias is exclusion of certain races, age, and other characteristics through job advertisements, searching to buy a home, and such. An example is when Amazon tried to use AIs to scan through resumes, but it resulted in sexism. According to Reuters, Amazon was hoping that this type of technology could process through the sorting of job applications more efficiently. Google can also act as echo chambers when users search for specific keywords in a single search, and it can have implied prejudices as results. Another example for continued discrimination is that algorithmic bias can affect how police officers are being deployed in certain neighborhoods. A Vice article mentions that this program called PredPol uses algorithms to predict crime in specific areas by 500 feet by 500 feet sections of a city, so that police officers can patrol or survey certain areas, and through the data gathered, they assume certain crimes can commit at particular times and how frequently they can happen. A popular documentary film called Coded Bias goes over the inaccuracies of AI in facial recognition technology and automated assessment software. Such problems result from racial and gender biases, and major companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon use this type of technology. It is necessary to address the problems with AI facial recognition technology, since it is a growing form that has become abundant to the general public, like with one's iPhone. Along with the news that more governments are purchasing or developing facial recognition technology. Now, when NPR was interviewing Joy, she had emphasized on the FDA model, which is acknowledging that not all drugs work for everybody, there are limitations. She meant that for programs. She is deploying AI systems so that programs will fit for different types of people and not just a one-size-fits-all. Now, what are some solutions? Joseph Blass had mentioned using a third-party safeguarding method, in which companies do not have direct access to the collected data that would be used to develop their data sets to construct systems to prevent discrimination. A suggested method would be taking legal action. An example would be with Joshua Kroll and his colleagues, in which they argued to change current employment discrimination laws so that it can compel engineers to design programs for non-discrimination. Another suggestion was by Tobias Bayer with calibration. Calibration is like a litmus test for whether an algorithm estimates correctly what it is supposed to estimate. It compares predictions with actual outcomes, so it is like a backwards way of looking. The issues that surface from algorithms is still new, and legal action is slow since this topic is unprecedented for governments. Finding clear solutions to prevent algorithmic bias is still uncertain, and methods that researchers are testing are not guarantees. However, awareness and pressure on companies to double-check and continuously update their datasets to reduce algorithmic bias should be a common practice in the meantime. For now, third-party safeguarding and calibration seem more viable and more effective compared to legal changes. However, with more technology advancing, legal changes eventually have to happen so that they are not vague and that non-discrimination laws can be more effective. Now, I would firstly like to thank for coming to my presentation and listening. I hope that people are more aware of the complex issues with algorithms and how they can affect us in a subtle way. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a great presentation, and I appreciate how relevant that topic is. It's very true. There are a lot of algorithmic biases that, we would deal with on the day-to-day, being on our phone so much. It's pretty obvious, you search one thing somewhere and then the ad pops up somewhere else or whatnot. But I appreciate also that you related it to, I had no clue that it affects, crime rates, and, it works into some of the work that police officers do. So I appreciate that connection. Great presentation. I really loved it. I will now open up the Q&A to anyone else that has questions for Vanessa. And kind of like our previous Q&A, Vanessa, if you see someone or you have a message in the chat, just go ahead and answer. I'll let you facilitate that. And then I'll let you know if we're running out of time.
Okay, I'll answer John's question that was in the chat first. How has this issue gotten better in recent years, or is it the same as it always has been?
Sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Vanessa, but I think the volume's a little low for us.
Oh.
I don't know if. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I don't want to not let you or be heard.
Is it better now?
Yes, for everyone. Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'll be answering John's question. So I actually haven't looked into that yet for the statistics, but I'm going to assume that it could have been it's like oscillating, since there are people trying to help mitigate it, and because it's not just for social issues, but also just in whatever field of area that they're probably using algorithms or AIs for. But so far I haven't looked into it yet, but I definitely will.
So this is something that you can plan on doing continuous research on, or
Yeah.
more research on?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of more news and suggested solutions. Even after I submitted this, I was looking oh, what else other people could be doing. And because it's not a super easy, because humans make the algorithms, we make the codes. So it's not simply oh, just have this code or that code and have it processed this way, because it's not 100% guarantee, and people are constantly trying to find ways to get it as close as possible to be as unbiased as they can.
Well, excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Vanessa, what drew you to this topic originally? Yeah, was it a personal experience, or what made you want to study this?
So I'm taking this honors class, the Library 201 honors, and initially I didn't know what I wanted to do. I know that I wanted to dive into social issues, because these types of topics really pull me in, and I think they're super interesting. And our professor, Professor Perry, she had suggested lists, and there was a bunch that were towards bias and algorithms, and I typically don't go towards these types of topics because of the technicality. It is pretty difficult to catch on, because I'm not really a computer science person. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll try it. And as I researched more into it, I thought algorithmic mitigation was super interesting, because I was what are we doing now to help solve this? Because we're so far and going so fast with our technology.
Thank you.
I have a question. Do you think that the discriminatory practices are built into the algorithm in its design? It's a faulty design, or is it in the application? I wonder how. I think these algorithms would be an excellent spot to create, neutral or an equal platform. I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. When I was looking for the suggested solutions that researchers and publishers had, I think it's a mix of both. Some people, typically articles news articles, they justify, oh, it's made by humans, so it's more of the developers issue. But other types of publishers also said that, because it's not just like discrimination, but it's also like how it's processed, because typically these algorithms, some of them, they try to like do like they kind of like do like a pre-trial and to see how the outcome could be. And sometimes they might have like a kind of like a loophole, like they're missing like certain types of like biases or a type of information that could also like trickle down into something more. So it's a little bit mix of both. I think when it comes to like social media and like more of like personal information that like big companies would use, like Google, Instagram, Facebook, so on and so forth, I think it's more of a developers, because they rely on like personal information. And then, you know, the people who like work on the computers, they like, oh, this person is from this generation, so they might want this on their ads. But in like more professional or like work settings, I think it's more of a technical issue where they're just missing stuff. Thank you for asking.
Great. Do we have any more questions for Vanessa? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a great presentation and great job managing the Q&A very well. And again, thank you for the participating audience. Next up, we actually have a live presentation by Claire Benham. So Claire, if you're ready, I will hand it over to you and you can take it over.
Perfect.
Okay. You should have share screen abilities, but let me know if you're having any difficulty.
Thank you.
No problem. And then Claire's mentor was Professor Sarah Burns, who's here with us today.
Oops. Did not mean to share that. Alrighty. Okay. Hello, everybody. I have a sticky note over my thing. Alrighty, so we are going to be covering life-saving with language and curing with competency, addressing Hispanic and Latino healthcare disparities in the United States. And like Melina said, Professor Burns was my mentor for this, so thank you to her for all of her support. All right. In 2018, I was working at a hospital in my local hometown, and I worked on the progressive care unit or critical care unit. You've probably heard ICU a lot this year. We had a patient come in who had just suffered from a trans-ischemic attack or a stroke. She was recovering and she only spoke Spanish. So I went in with the nurse, and as the nurse began to do her initial assessments, she recognized the language barrier. When we're assessing a stroke recovery patient, we use a series of comprehensive examinations to determine the damage that the patient suffered from the stroke. With that language barrier, the nurse turned around to me and she said, "Hold on one second, let me go get the Spanish version." So what you see over here on the left side of the screen is a photograph. It's called the cookie theft photo. We'll have patients look at the photo and identify aspects within it. We gauge their ability to speak. It's called an aphasia test. So they would point things out. Like if I asked Melina, she would say, you know, that little boy is grabbing a cookie, or mom is doing the dishes. And then we would write down their score and gauge them from that. So the nurse walks out of the room and she goes and she grabs the Spanish version of this test put out by the National Institute of Health. I was a little confused. It's a picture, so I don't really understand how there could be a Spanish version of it, but I went with it. Don't worry, because this picture has been through 2 comprehensive phases of study. It has been recognized by the ethics panel of world-renowned hospitals. 7 physicians at the Mayo Clinic have reviewed it. This is the cultural adaptation of the National Institute of Health stroke scale. that took me by surprise. And ever since then, I have thought about that, promise you, almost every day. Everyone in my family knows about it, and it is actually the picture that drove this research. Hispanic and Latino minorities are disproportionately disadvantaged by the US healthcare system. It faces a history of systemic inequity, and at almost every intersect within our communities, our minority populations face some kind of obstacle that makes things like access to healthcare, quality of healthcare, representation, all difficult, if not, nearly impossible to have access to. This research covers the foundation of that inequity, that disproportionate disparities. I'm focusing specifically on our Hispanic and Latino population, but this research carries into all minority populations because discrimination is discrimination, and we have the ability to take action. This is going to identify the points within our healthcare system that we have failed in that aspect. So I start with this map of social determinants of health and structural inequity. Social determinants of health fall, in my opinion, specifically into individual, community, inter and interpersonal, and systemic factors. Structural inequity focuses more on big power. So if you think about social determinants of health more as an individualized person, and structural inequity more as the man. This gives you a brief overview of what that kind of means. So when we're looking at structural inequity, I reference it as power and politics. So we see systems of oppression, we see political reform, we see things that are not necessarily in control of our specific minority population that we're talking about, or individual patients in general. When we're looking at social determinants of health, you see that inner circle. It's your social environment, it's your family, it's your socioeconomic status, your housing environment, all of those more centralized and individual aspects that cater to a person. I think that when we're addressing this topic, the most important thing to cover above anything else is defining culture, race, and ethnicity. These terms have been broadly and ambiguously used for as long as we can remember, oftentimes not even understood. I'm sure if I asked several of you right now to give me in 10 seconds a brief history of your culture, race, and ethnicity, that most of you probably couldn't do it. I couldn't. I mean, do we really even understand what those entail? So I want to cover that because I think that that is the foundation of the inequity for all minorities when we're talking about diversity in that sense. So race is the categorization of humans based on shared physical features. That's what I want you to remember from this. Physical features, a social construct with a history of oppression. And we can dig deep into a history lesson about where race came from, but ultimately it was to justify slavery and try and understand the dynamics of liberty when Americans or colonizers were still holding slaves as their own property. The US Census Bureau recognizes 5 races, and then 1/6 category, which is other. So we cover white, Black or African American, Asian, American Indian, and Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and then other. Now, other, it's a self-identification on the census, so you have the ability to choose what you identify as. Like I said, it's a social construct. This is not genetic or biological. That's important to understand. There's no genetic determinants for your race. Ethnicity refers to a group of people who share common cultural markers and a common history. So the US Census identifies Hispanic and Latino as an ethnicity and not Hispanic and Latino as an ethnicity. And that is the parameters for which you can identify. So a lot, since we're talking specifically about our Hispanic and Latino population, a lot of people will identify as white and Hispanic and Latino. And there's been a lot of controversy over whether that is equitable, whether that is proper representation. The Hispanic and Latino demographics in the United States are an important variable to understand as well, because when we're covering this, we're talking about healthcare. This is the health of our future. This is the foundation of our country. Hispanics make up more than half of the total United States population growth. That's 60.6 million people. This affects our economic foundation. This affects our cultural foundations. I mean, San Diego County alone, the predominantly white American population is the minority. And we have a huge network of hospitals and healthcare systems that consistently see these disparities. So it's an important thing to acknowledge, especially where we live. So then we have to understand how we identify Hispanic and Latino, because that is also commonly confused, or Spanish. Hispanic refers to people who are from an ancestral tie of Spanish-speaking countries. It's linguistically focused, while Latino or Latinx, which is a more inclusive term, is referring to a more geographic focus. So it's talking about people who come specifically from Latin American countries. Oftentimes people will be considered Spanish, which their origin is Spain. That does make them Hispanic, but not all people who are Hispanic or identify as Hispanic are Spanish. So it's a bit of a confusing delineation, and it's something that's important to understand when we're addressing this, because these titles and the way that we talk about them and the way that we respect their culture is the foundation of that, of our work here. So healthcare inequity moving forward. Cultural competency, representation, language concordance, bias, and systemic racism. These are what I have identified as the 4 most prevalent issues within our healthcare system and facing the Hispanic and Latino minority population. This is a really hard topic to cover because it's systematic, right? So racism is the foundation of these issues, and we can go into tangents on tangents of variables that play into this, but ultimately, without addressing the systemic issue and the bias and the representation, we're not going to get anywhere with this problem. This, and I don't expect you to read it. Don't look too hard. This is a perspective for you. When I'm talking about all of the variables that we have to cover, this was my my mind map that I submitted to Professor Burns at the beginning of our process in this research project. And I wasn't going to include it because it's messy and scary, but I think it's really important. I think it's really important that when we're addressing these issues, you see just how complex it is. It doesn't just chalk down to the simple, 4-word slides that I put in front of you. It is a history and a system that has failed people across the globe, not just our Hispanic and minority populations, with lack of access to healthcare, with discriminatory studies, with, lack of language concordance, which means, they're not receiving adequate translation or resources for translation, which then in turn leads to patient satisfaction going down. It leads to, dangerous patient outcomes, because think about going into surgery and me handing you a bottle of narcotics and telling you how many to take and when to take them, and you not necessarily being able to understand because you are not being properly represented for your language. So these are all things that we really need to consider, but they are just tiny little drops in the bucket. This map represents all of the branches just at the the start of our research that I identified as issues. So I want you to understand how complex this is and how this research is going to move us forward. This presentation is to educate you and to identify where the focal points are, but there is so much more to do. So where can we start? You can start with a conversation. It's what we're doing right now. You are taking the first step, starting by getting educated on diverse terms like race, like ethnicity, nationality, culture. We can dig into more complex ideas about these dynamics and whether or not we should still be using them within science. Radical and comprehensive cultural competency and intervention. This means moving forward and destroying the variables that create this systemic bias and racism within our doctors. But like I said, it starts with education. It starts with a conversation. We move forward with action, with policy, with contacting your government entities. And then community involvement ultimately is going to be the biggest aspect. You'll see the greatest change is when your community comes together. And I think that we've all witnessed that within the past year with the outbreak of COVID-19, with dealing with social unrest. I mean, there are so many things that have been tragic and awful, but our communities have come together and we've seen radical change. And I think that the power is in the people, quite literally, and you are the people, so it starts with us. I want to revisit this picture. I want you to think about what it would mean to draw a photograph for me in Spanish. It's kind of a weird concept. I mean, I don't know how I would do it. I think that if we can't represent that immediately on the spot, why should there ever be a cultural adaptation that was approved by 7 Mayo Clinic physicians, by 2 phases of a comprehensive study, and that looks like a kindergartner drew it? That's not appropriate. That's not equitable. That's not fair or representative. And this, I think, is an exact representation of how our minority populations are treated generally within our healthcare system. When I did the research surrounding this picture, it was hard to dig up. And I ended up contacting somebody at the hospital I used to work at, and she said that they're still using it there, and that it is the nationally accredited photograph, the SVNIHSS, the Spanish version of the National Institute of Health Stroke Scale. It is the cultural interpretation. So the way they develop it is trying to identify how to represent this culture, this language's culture. They have Russian versions, German versions, and the fact that this is what they came up with is horrifying. Hispanic and Latino minorities face disproportionate disparity within the US healthcare system, but they are not the only ones. I addressed several actionable steps: education, radical change and action, and community outreach. We can implement these to make change. However, true change will never occur until we address the systemic and historical racism among our diverse country. that is where we have to truly start. So I hope that you're able to walk away with this with a better understanding, just a fundamental understanding of the points where you and I might face easier access to healthcare, or we might be able to just walk into our doctor's office, get a checkup, get a blood panel. That's not the case for everybody. And I think it's important to understand how significantly that can impact our society economically, and just within our community population. So I have a couple resources here. I mean, I have about 1,000 resources. So if anybody's interested, I'll send you a page, but I think that these are really wonderful places to start. LULAC is the League of United Latin American Citizens. And then Professor Burns actually was the one that introduced me to this racial equities term glossary. So that's a really good place to start for education. And I have so that is, thank you guys.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. I personally am I actually did research for last OMNI and health disparity, so this was a very, interesting presentation to me, and I like how you specifically went towards, certain demographics. It definitely helped narrow the presentation. It's crazy to see how we use race in healthcare. I know in a previous course I learned that specifically Hispanic and Latino women are seen as being dramatic in healthcare, so doctors may not take their pain as seriously. So, that's just one issue, and it plays into many different, aspects in our healthcare. So thank you for tackling such an important topic. I really enjoyed it, very detailed. I learned a lot, so thank you for that. And Claire, I'll let you facilitate your own Q&A if you have any questions. Please feel free to ask Claire. I don't know if you want to stop your share screen so then we can see everybody, if you prefer that.
Yeah.
And then you can get right into it, and I'm sure we have some great questions in the audience. So feel free to jump on in if you have any questions.
There are a few questions in the chat also.
Oh, okay. Gosh, I'm not technologically savvy. Has this issue gotten better in recent years, or is it the same as it has always been, or has it gotten worse? That's a really great question. And I think it's kind of hard to answer, because in order to answer it, we would have to have a metric for what is worse than what we have already put, minority populations through in terms of racism and discrimination. I think that as our culture adapts, our understanding of better or worse also adapts. I think it has gotten better, and I kind of hate to say that because it's not good. But we have seen progress. And when I was doing my research, I had a really hard time at the beginning honing in on a specific topic. When I showed you that mind map, I was very overwhelmed because I was like, wow, this is a really messed up system. And I was very proud to see all of the resources that are out there for very specific topics, but this research kind of encompasses the broader aspect of the foundational issues, and you don't see a lot of that anywhere. So it's good that we're covering everything. I think it's also really important to start this conversation in a more broad and general way. Yes, it is disgusting. That picture is awful. I understand your frustration over there. It's actually a way to make images for us to understand. Elijah, what do you mean by that? I'm really interested. I don't know if you
So what I mean by it is there's very similar words in Spanish or Spanish related to English and stuff. So I believe that, it is very disgusting seeing this and everything, and the fact that it was passed down and approved, and this is what we get if there's a language barrier and stuff. But I guess I'm pretty much saying that we can improve this picture pretty much. That's the end point of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that ties into the conversation of cultural competency, which is a huge concept within this, this issue, and being able to respectfully represent a culture. Not like that. That's not respectful representation. It's horrifying, quite frankly. And so I agree with you. I think that we absolutely can find a more respectful way to, you know, create an adaptation specific to Spanish-speaking populations, but that definitely is not it. How long ago were the studies done on the Spanish version of the NIHS image? You know, I think I have it written down. I want to say it was like 2006. It was quite a while ago, but I think you could approach that in two different ways. You could say, oh, it was from 2006. I'm sure perspectives have changed now, but the reality of it is that they haven't, and we're still using it in a level 2 trauma center, which I don't know if any of you work in healthcare. I mean, we take strokes and heart attacks and traumas, and that can't be, you know, that can't be our standard. And the fact that at 18, I saw that and was horrified by it. And now we're in 2021 and I'm calling up my coworkers and they're telling me that that's still the standard on a critical care unit. It's scary, honestly. Will you continue to research this? Yes, Jade, I plan to continue this research. I'm hoping that this will be the foundation for my undergraduate thesis and something that I will carry on for a long time. I'm a Spanish major. I grew up in a dual immersion elementary school, and so that's where my ties to that are. And then I'm also working towards like a pre-med track. And so I'm hoping that with the use of this research, I can then carry that into my bachelor's degree in Spanish and then, hopefully medical school, and take this so much further than just, talking about it, really being able to take actionable steps within that community. So I do hope that it will change. I don't think that one person can change racism and bias, but I think that collectively it is taking the right steps. We can make a difference. Just want to thank you, Alex. Sorry, I'm a slow reader. NVTHS, what's that acronym mean? Erin, where did you see that? National. Do you remember?
I think he might be referring to the
NIH. So the NIH is the National Institute of Health, and then the NIHSS is the National Institute of Health Stroke Scale, and then the SVNIHSS is the Spanish version National Institute of Health Stroke Scale. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Christy has a question as well. Looks
Yeah.
like.
Yes, I do. Do you think, these are just your thoughts, do you think that Spanish, because Hispanic does take your percentages on the population, do you think that Spanish should be somewhat of a requirement as a foreign language for any kind of healthcare student just in school, starting with school? Like, I just kind of want to know your thoughts on that.
That's such a great question. Yeah, so I to an extent, that plays back into cultural competency and language concordance, which were two big major topics that it's hard to dig so deep into in such a short amount of time. But I do think that a greater system or education within medical schools should exist that covers language and cultural competency, and they do with ethics and cultural competency, but I don't think that it's extensive enough, obviously. You can't, we're treating people, and that ties into person-centered healthcare, which is a whole nother topic, but being able to teach language. I mean, I work at an outpatient surgical center right now, and I'm sure many of you speak Spanish. It's a really common, language, and you would be horrified if you were on our surgical table and you woke up to our anesthesiologists trying to say good morning to you in Spanish with the little, college Spanish that they have, which that effort is there, but if we could have better representation of that. So in short, I do think that there needs to be more education, especially I think that you should know just as much about ethics and culture as you do about bones and blood.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to kind of wrap up the Q&A if that's okay. I believe we got a lot of great questions, so that was great. I really enjoyed your presentation, and we can definitely see how invested you are in this topic, which is very nice to see. And I like that you have that, working in healthcare perspective and discussing this topic. It definitely helps, us have a better understanding as well. So thank you for that. And again, thank you to everyone participating today. I wanted to drop our commentary form into the chat. Oops, I had it copy and pasted, one sec. But the commentary form is pretty much just a way that all the presenters today can get some feedback from everyone here, and maybe, ways to improve their presentation, or if they did something great, I'm sure they'd love to hear it. So please feel free to fill it out. I'm dropping it in. Oh, Elizabeth, for some reason I'm not allowed to copy and paste it in. Do you have it by chance?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay.
And then we're going to take about a 15-minute break before we come back for Melina and Alma's presentation. So feel free to stick around, sorry, there's the commentary form for everyone. So feel free to stick around and just, go on mute, etc. for the next 15 minutes. We'll probably work out some tech stuff in the meantime. And then, yeah, but feel free to stick around. We'd love to have you guys for our next session.
And great job to all the presenters. So thank you very much. And again, thank you for everyone in the audience. And if you'd like to hang out, that'd be great. If not, we totally understand. So now's your time to head out or join back in whenever you like. Okay, so thank you so much, and be sure to check the program for future presentations that we have going on. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Melina, I'm going to try sharing. I might have lost Melina. Professor Burns, are you sticking around? Oh no, she's gone. Oh, you are there. I just want to see if you can hear my audio. I just want to test it out, and I'm going to share my screen for you. I don't want. I don't want people not to be able to hear your presentation.
Yeah. Okay. I can't believe, yeah. When you share screen, there should be sound or share sound.
Okay. Well, let's see. Can you hear it? Okay.
No, well, I mean, I hear, but I think you did what I did the first time too.
Okay. Okay. Stop share. Share screen.
At the bottom left, it should say share sound. When you see all the screens, you can share.
Computer sound. Got it.
But all my research is your home is not always your.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Go take a little break.
All right. I'll be back. Thank you. And if I may, sorry, I just want to give a disclaimer about my presentation. I edited on my phone because it's easier for me and I get it more. But the presentation on the computer shows the slides move a lot. I'm sure you've seen that sometimes when you do it. So I apologize for that. On my phone, it doesn't show much movement. So I guess during the transfer to the computer, it started moving. But content is good. Visuals, I apologize. They do shift.
Oh, good. Sorry, I'm having, let me try this again. Okay. And then just holler at me if you can't hear or see it once we get started, so that we don't go down that road of not having it play. So, here we go.
Your safe space, where we'll go into depth about the relationship between housing and health. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Professor Faust and Professor Perry for their research opportunity and the guidance through my project. To get us started today, I'd like you to reflect on a moment when you've had a cough or maybe shortness of breath. What did you think caused that to happen? Maybe you thought of the day you took a cold shower, then went outside, or slept with your window open, or maybe you caught something while hanging out with a sick friend. Those are all logical conclusions to draw. However, could you ever imagine your home being the cause of your health problems? If you find this to be a far-fetched idea, then you should consider yourself lucky. For a large population of our society, we see a strong correlation between one's health and their housing. In order to better understand the relationship between housing and health, this research will highlight specific examples of how a person's health has become jeopardized because of their living conditions. Then we'll try to understand the bigger picture of why we see a disproportionate spread of housing inequalities. And finally, we'll take the time to understand some possible solutions. With some changes to our healthcare system, we have the opportunity to get to the root of an individual's health concerns and strive for better housing. Now let's get into some background. For this research, housing is an umbrella term for the environment one lives in. That includes air quality and the housing condition itself. According to the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotions, they define housing quality as the physical condition of a person's home, as well as the quality of the social and physical environment in which the home is located. Housing quality has a great effect on our lives. Poor housing quality is associated with various negative health outcomes, including chronic disease, injury, and poor mental health. The next term we'll talk about is social detriments. These are the economic and social conditions that influence individuals and group differences in health status. The final term is life chances, and this is the theory of the opportunities each individual has to improve his or her life quality. Now that we have some context on some terms that we'll get into a little later, let's get into the real relationship between housing and health. In an article from the Housing and Health Inequalities, share a synthesis of systematic reviews of interventions aimed at different pathways linking housing and health. They explain the relationship between housing and health in 3 pathways. This includes internal housing conditions, area characteristics, and housing tenure, which are all social detriments of health and can increase an individual's stress levels. Social detriments of health are controlled by structural issues within our society, as well as life chances, which again is the theory of opportunities each individual has to improve his or her quality of life. Not everyone has to deal with poor housing quality, but the same way some people see their home as their safe haven, for many it is the root cause of some of their physical and mental health problems and the cause of majority of the stress in their life. According to Housing and Health Inequalities, they share how the 3 specific ways housing and health relate are seen. Internal housing conditions have potential to influence health. Cold and damp conditions may cause or exacerbate respiratory health conditions. Poisoning may be caused by lead piping, lead paint, or carbon monoxide. In addition, housing design and street layout can impact on psychosocial outcomes, and housing tenure may also have an impact on one's health. For example, owning one's home can create a greater sense of security or prestige than social or private renting, and is often used as an indicator of greater long-term command over resources. The issue with housing quality lies in the disproportionate spread among racial groups and social class. Deprived areas experience higher levels of crime and social disorder, making it more stressful and dangerous to live in them. They also suffer the most with poor housing quality. For instance, impoverished areas lack access to amenities that other neighborhoods may have. As a society, where do we begin to provide a better way of living to those in impoverished areas? How do we fight social structures to provide better lives for people? Now let's take a look at how housing impacts our physical health. To understand the extent of which our homes can impact our physical health, I went and found a few examples from a few different sources to help better illustrate the lasting effects. It is important to keep in mind the unequal distribution of health has led to a growing awareness that health is socially determined by factors originating in different levels of society. In a more general perspective, deprived areas may experience higher levels of crime and social disorder, making it more stressful and dangerous to live in them. Stress is bad for anybody, but especially children. There's something called toxic stress, which is the response that can occur when a child experiences strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity. Toxic stress can lead to lifelong health problems like heart disease or cancer. It can also lead to mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, or even suicide. That may already seem like enough. However, there is a surplus of issues within the household that can affect one's physical health. The article, Housing and Health Inequalities, share many aspects of internal housing conditions have the potential to influence health. In particular, cold, damp conditions may cause respiratory health conditions. Lack of safety equipment can lead to many injuries, particularly among children and elderly. Lack of smoke alarms, such as fire extinguishers and sprinklers, may exacerbate the risk of injury from fire. There's some evidence that housing design and street layout can also impact one's psychosocial outcomes. Many of these household issues can go unrecognized for years. Then one day we notice we have trouble breathing or we have a new disease to worry about, and it started from our home. Housing does not just affect one's physical health, it has the ability to affect one's mental health. Before providing evidence as to how we see a relation between one's mental health and their home, think of your time during COVID lockdown. Was it a breeze to live, work, and play at home with your family or roommates 24/7? Although COVID was an isolated situation and we have seen housing continuously affect one's mental health through the years, COVID has emphasized existing issues with one's home. In the academic journal, The Conversation, they share stories from lockdown. Interviews show how poor housing quality made life even more tough. In this source, we will specifically be discussing the overall conclusion of the effects housing has on both physical and especially mental health. The article states that many households express a suspicion that landlords were using lockdown as an excuse to indefinitely postpone or delay repair works, and others reported that their landlords refused to arrange repairs. People told us about leaking roofs and guttering, and about how water coming into their household had caused internal damage, damp, and mold. If a household had a minor issue with a leak in the past, the issue has now worsened to the point where it can have detrimental effects on one's health. The article shares accounts from individuals who now have to deal with moldy, damp living conditions. One person shares, "I've got really bad damp in my house. It's always bothered me, but it's bothered me more and more and more because I work from home, and I'm working in the kitchen and I'm looking at it every day, directly seeing it there. It's just getting worse. The landlord keeps saying, there's nothing I can do." If the situation was unbearable before, spending all day, every day at home, it is now unlivable. However, beyond physical issues with the home, there are financial issues that some may argue have greater effect on one's mental health. Think of the security of your home. How likely are you to pay your bills on time? Is your home a rental or do you own it? Evidently, there are a lot of reasons one's mental health may suffer due to their housing. For instance, community health, residential stability, how often family moves, crowding, and homelessness all have physical and mental effects on your health. The outcome can be youth behavioral problems, violence, injuries, and cohesion and civil engagement. We can see that all of these outcomes are stemmed within one's home and their environment. Housing inequality is not seen amongst everyone, and although all races are affected, there is structural racism that leads some people into poor housing more than others. Let's take a look at the bigger issue. Systematic racism is a form of racism that is embedded through laws within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education. For this research, we will be analyzing systematic racism in healthcare. In the article, the pandemic has exacerbated health instability for renters of color. They describe specific inequalities during COVID. However, they also shed light on the history of racial discrimination in housing. Specifically, in 2019, before the coronavirus pandemic, an estimated 34 million individuals were living in poverty in the United States, with Black and Latinx people experiencing higher rates of poverty than whites. Native Americans, Black, and Latinx renters were also more likely to be extremely low income. Either you have experienced or heard of the long history of housing insecurity amongst people of color, as they are racially targeted, and this has led to discriminatory practices and disparities in housing options. You may think that by now there would have been some progress in limiting this discrimination. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, which prohibits discrimination against applicants and tenants based on various identities, including race. Although, despite that, the Federal Housing Act and its amendments overt and subtle racial discrimination still occurs. In 2019, 8,200 fair housing applicants were filed for discrimination based on housing or national origin. Much like many efforts to stop systematic racism, we see the FHA fail. One of the previous concerns about housing and health mentioned is stress. Stress can affect us physically and mentally, specifically people of color. Cost-burden renters, particularly those of color, are the most at risk of eviction due to the increased likelihood of missing rent payments. The everyday stress of knowing whether or not you can pay your bills negatively impacts one's overall well-being, and it is not because of one is unwilling to work hard to have a better life. It is because of the systematic racism engraved in our society, in housing, criminal justice, education, and healthcare, and it affects people of color much more. They are more likely to experience homelessness across their lifespan. As a result, communities of color are overrepresented in homeless populations, with nearly 40% of people experience homelessness identifying as Black, 22% as Latinx, and 3% as Native American, and 2% as Pacific Islander. How do we try to protect those who have been pushed into poor housing, and how can we improve their mental health? With all this information in mind, there are still some hopeful solutions. And although it would be nice to stop systematic racism and fix everyone's housing situation, we are far from that. We can still take a step towards fair and equal society. One of the small changes we can make is in our healthcare. Risha Manshada discusses in a TED Talk on a different way of looking at healthcare, the upstreamist approach. It is a simple solution where doctors ask the right questions and know the community in order to get to the root of the problem. In order to better understand the upstreamist approach, it is important to understand the downstreamist approach, which is where interventions are located closest to the parent source of health problems. This is how our healthcare has worked in the past and still continues to work in many areas. When you go to the doctor's office, they are reactive treatments rather than proactive treatments. You are given some medication or inhaler rather than being asked if your house has a leak or mold. Dr. Manshada shares specific instances where he uses the upstreamist approach. For example, his patient Veronica lives in South Central LA and her home had roaches, mold, and water leak. Dr. Manshada pointed out her chronic illnesses, but what was different about his approach was that he pointed out the causes of the illness started at home. He provided treatment plans that went beyond the doctor's office by involving a community healthcare worker and public interest lawyer. Her symptoms started to improve by 90%, and her son was no longer dealing with asthma once Dr. Manshada's efforts improved her housing condition. This is where we see how important it is to identify that our health begins where we work, where we play, and where we live. By altering our approach to healthcare, we can help limit the negative effects on one's home has on their health. Rather than putting someone on medication, we can go to the root of the problem to see if our health problems are started at home or by some other external factors.
the time, these unstable and unsafe living conditions are not following proper legal regulations, and with the right assistance can be improved, just like we saw in Veronica's story. Ultimately, the solution is to use the upstreamist approach in our healthcare and truly ask the right questions in the doctor's office. And as patients, we can help by letting our doctors know of any pre-existing issues in our household. While we remain patient in the pursuit of a fair social structure, we can take an alternative approach and use the upstreamist approach in order to stop our home from being the downfall to our health and to truly make our home our safe haven. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melina. Really appreciate that. I'll get the Q&A started just by asking you, I know this was connected to your presentation from last semester, but what drew you to this and made you interested in this topic?
Same with my other presentation. I took a sociology of health and illness course, and just everything I was learning in that class, I was like, there's no way, like, how is this possible? And then especially if you like issues within the healthcare and not maybe applying the upstreamist approach, or maybe doctors not trying to get to the root of the problem. Sorry, I read the chat while I was speaking, but it just, by using that approach, it's amazing how much we can improve housing if we get, like mentioned in the presentation, public interest lawyers involved and stuff like that. And I was just really intrigued by the strong relation between the two. And it's very common. I mean, you may have a leak you don't know about, and then you may feel like, it can lead to asthma for many people, and it's overcrowding is an issue. It's just a lot of the stuff that we may not be aware about, or many people don't have to deal with it, which is also, good, but, just making people aware. And yeah, I just was really interested by the relation, and also just want to see improvement in that area. I did see a question in the chat, but yes, I think it will be. I'm personally, I'm interested in law, so all this research, I want to fight like civil rights cases in healthcare eventually, so I will continue the research and then hopefully apply it as like a future career. But yeah, definitely something, just health disparities in general, and just how health and sociology kind of mix together in healthcare as well is something I'm interested in. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
If I could follow up real quick with a, sorry, Elizabeth. With a quick follow-up, did you experience any significant challenges doing this research?
Honestly, no, because it is very common. I think my biggest issue was narrowing down location, because a lot of the research, it's not just in the US. I came upon articles that have, talk about issues in housing in the UK and Australia. So I think it was more about narrowing down my research because, like I mentioned, it is a big issue everywhere. But as far as finding the information, finding the relationship, no, because there is a relationship between the two. And I actually kind of worked in reverse. I already knew about the upstreamist approach, and it's something I've used in previous research, and I'm very fond of it. So I kind of worked in that direction. I had my endpoint, what was the solution, and I kind of worked to find how I could get there. That's just how I did it. Vanessa, I believe that's a hands up.
So it's a little off topic, but since you were talking about COVID and how it is greatly affecting these types of groups of people, were you able to come into information about the eviction laws and such, how they're identifying people, and because typically from what I see on the news, during that small period of time, they were evicting people who probably aren't well versed in housing laws and so on and so forth, and it's usually typically lower income neighborhoods and such.
Definitely. So I didn't specifically research the eviction laws, but obviously the same kind of systematic racism that plays into housing and what kind of housing you can get, I'm sure plays into something along those lines. And everything's all connected. My last image kind of shows a domino effect of everything. And that's something I really like that image because it really explains most of the topics I was talking about. And it's really all a domino effect. Like you mentioned, it's that those kind of laws are affecting a certain group of people. So I personally did not research it, but maybe now that's something I'll look into, the eviction laws. But thank you for the question.
Was there something that surprised you in your research?
I think mainly reading about like the stories of individuals, specifically like how the relationship between the landlords, like you would hope that during times, you know, of COVID, people would kind of come together, there'd be more of an understanding. And even the story about the landlords not coming in to help the people who had, you know, issues with their housing, it was during the period where you could do that. It wasn't like that 2-week period where it was total quarantine. So I think it's just, you know, that plays into like humanity and how we're willing to help other people. So that was kind of hard to hear. And I think just the numbers in one of the slides where it's, you know, talking about certain individuals who no longer have the housing they used to, or even, you know, the failure of the FHA. So a few things have obviously surprised me, and more in the like, I can't believe that happened sort of situation, rather than like thinking it's unimaginable. So definitely surprised and not fond of the results, but you know, it helps to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. We really appreciate it. Are there any other questions before we transition to our next presenter? Okay, so our next presenter is Alma Cuevas, and her faculty mentor was Janelle West, and her presentation today is entitled Phosphate, looking into how detergents affect the environment. So she talks about how laundry detergent phosphates are a very common ingredient, and she talks about cost differences, etc. So I'm really excited to learn more. And Alma, you can go ahead and share your screen with us and take it away.
So my presentation is on phosphate and looking into how detergents influence the environment in a negative way. And for my research, I went personally to these different stores, and I looked at the ingredients in the detergents and the dish detergents. And what surprised me about it at first was that most of them don't really have the full ingredients, and they lead you to a website and then they don't really tell you, so you have to like research a lot about that. So that's what I did. So phosphate comes from rocks, and so phosphate occurs naturally, and then when like, you know, like rain and it from like it comes so sorry so phosphorus is a natural thing that occurs, and it's mostly found in rock. And so when there's a heavy rainfall, that weathers the rock and it carries it down into bodies of water. But it can also be mined, and there are a ton of other environmental issues that also occur when it's mined. So phosphate in itself is not bad. It's only bad when it's used in fertilizers, detergents, or animal feed, because with fertilizers, if you put too much fertilizer and there's heavy rain, all that fertilizer is being washed into a body of water, and if there's already phosphate in the rain, the excess amount of phosphate in the fertilizer, detergents, or animal feed will also wash into the body of water. And this causes algal blooms, and this is because there's an excess input of phosphate in the body of water, and it can cause fish or ecosystems to break down, and it would cause less biodiversity. And then so we see that bodies of water are dying off. And so what is happening in these bodies of water is that when the phosphate enters the body of water, there's a process called eutrophication. And so the algal blooms are basically sucking the oxygen out of the water, and this is why the fish can't survive. And so right here we see a red tide, and then there's these bioluminescent algal blooms. I think we've seen them in Oceanside this summer actually, but there's toxic algal blooms and then there's non-toxic algal blooms, and the one that we saw in Oceanside was the non-toxic algal bloom. It's just not really recommended for you to go swimming into the algal bloom. But when it gets really excess and it gets really big, that's when it becomes a problem. And so in 1993, which is quite a time period, they banned the use of phosphate in laundry detergents, which was surprising to me because I thought that laundry detergents had a lot of phosphate. Turns out that some laundry detergents still have phosphate in them, but they still regulate the amount of phosphate that is in the laundry detergent. So in this case, 0.5% of phosphate can be in the laundry detergent. So although there's still phosphorus in the laundry detergent, it's a very minor amount. And in July 1st, 2010, any laundry detergent could not have more than 1.5% of phosphate in it. But what I found from my research was that typically there were not like name brand laundry detergents that had phosphate in them. And it might get confusing, but so the laundry detergents can't access the amount on my presentation, but dish detergents can still contain more phosphate, which I don't know why that happens. And it's kind of upsetting that laundry detergents got that ban, but dish detergents are still allowed to have phosphate in them. And so, like I said previously, I went to like Dollar Tree stores and like that, and then for my mid price, I went to like Target and like Walmart's, and then for my high priced stores, I went to like Home Goods and like Sprouts, those type of stores. And it surprised me that in the low price, there were some detergents with phosphate in them, and I had to do a little bit more of background research for those ones, because they kind of didn't want you to find out that they had phosphate in them, or at least that's what I got from like my research, because I had to dig deep. But there were less options for phosphate-free, both laundry detergents and dish detergents. Because as I was doing my research, I found that laundry detergents there wasn't a significant amount of laundry detergents with phosphate and without. And so I moved to dish detergents as well. And so in my mid price, the majority of them were detergents without phosphate, which made me really happy. And there were more options, but of course it's like mid price. So, and then with like Sprouts and like those type of stores, there were tons of options, and there was a wide variety of phosphate-free dish detergents and laundry detergents, which made me really happy. But of course, you have to weigh in if you're going to spend the money on phosphate-free detergents and dish detergents, or you're gonna go for the low price because you're on a budget. And that made me really think about how people from like lower income areas will probably go for the low priced detergent than the high priced detergent, because they're on a budget, rather than people who can spend the extra money on the high priced detergent, which I kind of saw like a disparity in that. And that's the end. Oh, there you go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to start out with my always question that everyone's used to by now, but why study this, and what surprised you about your research? And then hopefully some other people can jump in with some other questions too.
Yeah, so when I began my biology class, we learned about the phosphorus cycle, and our teacher was like, oh yeah, there's like free, like phosphate free detergent, and you know, like it's a little bit more gentle on the environment and algal blooms. And so I didn't really know that there was phosphate free detergents. I have seen them, but I didn't think that they would I didn't really think that people would know about phosphate free detergent. It's not something that we see on the news every day. And so that got me like interested in researching phosphate in detergents. But then I found out that we didn't really have phosphates in detergents, like laundry detergents. And so my professor recommended me to look at dish detergents because there was like a recently like 0.5% a regulation in like 2010, which is what like really recent. And so as I was looking into it, it got really interesting. And then John asks, what surprised you the most of my research? It surprised me that the low price still had like at least some phosphate-free soaps, which I really like appreciated, but you just had to like look into it more. So yeah, that really surprised me.
And then what would you say are some implications of your research going forward for us, your audience, for yourself, and just for our population in general?
I don't know. I mean, I would definitely, another question, sorry. John asks, is this research that you will be, oh yes, yeah, I will definitely like continuing this research. And I think that if people know about it more, then there will definitely be some changes in it. So yeah, in later years probably. Vanessa asks, do you happen to know, is there organization trying to tackle this like marine? Yes, they are trying, but they're kind of failing at it because laundry detergents are pretty much saying, I saw an article that's like, oh, are your dishes still dirty? This is why. And they're kind of like implying that phosphate needs to be in laundry detergents or dish detergents. And they're just like, well, like, are you gonna put your dishes at your health at risk for the environment? And I was just like, oh no, like oh gosh. And I mean, people like feed into it because they put their health and then the environment. They're just like, well, you know what? It's like doesn't matter that much, but it really does matter because if someone stops using soaps with phosphate, that's less phosphate going into the environment. Patricia asks, is there something we also need to watch out for in personal soaps and shampoos? What I do know about personal soaps and shampoos is that there's a lot of like like phosphates. It's basically the same thing as like detergents, but they don't really put that in it. That's another thing that I wanted to research was shampoos and like compare it to baby shampoos, and because I saw that they basically have the same ingredients, and they do like what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, they have like sulfate laurate in it, which is a common ingredient in laundry detergents and dish detergents. And yeah, that you have to keep out for that. Yeah, there's like Melina, there's a ton of like, once you start researching, you can't stop, to be honest. There's a lot of products that people use on a daily basis that have chemicals like that, and they don't disclose it. Like for some of the detergents that I was researching, I had to like take a picture of it and then go find research on it to find the ingredients that were in it and like the chemicals and everything. So that was one of my challenges, just researching every single like bottle. But what I did find was that Dawn dish soap does not use phosphates. So that was fun. I was like, oh no, so I first started researching like in my house, and I was like, oh gosh, it's phosphate free. I was like, yes, I win. So that was a good thing. And then then I was like, okay, like now let's like research all those other things. Yeah, Patricia, I was really happy. I was like, and then I didn't know if yes, Patricia, I win. I didn't know if to put like the name brands on the presentation because I didn't want to like implicate them in any way. I was very wary about the name brands that I put on there. But yeah. Is there any more questions?
I thought maybe Melina had one, but maybe not. Yeah, if there's no other questions, then we can conclude this section. And we only had these 2 presentations for this session. It was a little bit shorter of one. You can, if you'd like, pop over to room 1 if you're interested in watching some of their presentations, but otherwise, thank you guys so much. And then let me give you guys just one more time the commentary form link, so you can go ahead and fill those forms out if you'd like. And like I said, I think there's a couple more presentations happening in room 1 if you want to go there, but otherwise we'll restart here in room 2 at 1 p.m. And again, thank you so much, Alma and Melina.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you. Good job, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.